Welcome to our panel on bringing agility and DevOps practices to the database world. And I am Rachel Stevens. I'm going to moderate. I am currently an analyst with RedMonk. We do software industry analysis focused on developers. But I also bring the experience of a former DBA to this process. So that's kind of my viewpoint. And I'm going to let our panelists go ahead and introduce themselves quickly.
My name is Elisabeth Hendrickson. I work for Pivotal. I'm part of the R&D leadership team. I'm responsible for Gemfire, Pivotal Cloud Cache. I have been deeply involved in Greenplum and am getting involved in PKS.
I'm Roy Bryant. I'm VP of Cloud at Scotiabank. I've been there for about a year. The prior 6 years I've been at Google building out cloud.
I'm Dormaine Drewitz. I'm actually on the product marketing team, kind of just been circling the drain on this topic of data and DevOps and Agile for a couple of years. So very honored to be included on a panel of much more esteemed experts than I.
Wonderful. Well, we're excited. We have lots of topics to dive into. I think the general backdrop of why we put this panel together and why we wanted to talk about it is that we have seen tremendous changes in the world of application development over the last few years. In particular, it's accelerating in the pace of change. And the database world really has not seen such a rapid evolution yet. There are some companies that are still managing databases the way they did a decade or more ago. And so what does that look like in terms of how to go fast when part of your database, the crucial part of your organization, the data part, hasn't moved at the same pace as the rest of your application development, and kind of how can we start to bring new practices to that and kind of bring our DevOps perspectives to the data world. And so I think our first question is, what are the forces that have historically kept data and data teams siloed?
Okay, I'll start this one off. I think this is actually similar to a lot of the other organizational silo patterns that you've seen across IT and just in different org structures. So, whether it's just a different reporting structure that kind of leads to, a different set of priorities and objectives. One thing that seems to be kind of partly at the root of this is, data is over there, and there's a different set of concerns that they're addressing. Whereas the development organization, many of times those might be actually much closer to the business unit. So, data teams sort of focusing on, hey, reliability and security and governance, having a different orientation as to what their priorities and who their customers are, to me seems to be like one of those things that has kind of led to a rift, if you will.
I think a big part of it is that it's hard to discover data and understand what it is. So every time somebody starts up a new project, they can't figure out anybody else's data, so they open a new database and they throw a bunch of stuff in there and get another copy of it and live in their little world. And then it's hard to bring them together.
I don't have anything meaningful to add, so.
I'm going to throw in my DBA 2 cents real quick, and one of it I think is there is extraordinary perception of risk around data, both for the organization and for the people who are in charge of running the data. So a DBA is going to get fired if they lose data or if their database goes down. Like, there is extraordinary risk to change, or the perception of risk is high. And I think the other thing that you kind of touched on is that data definitions across the organization are not common and not standard. And so you have a lot of organizational pushes for like the single source of truth and not a lot of drive for anyone to actually change what their source of truth actually is. And so I think everyone likes their definition of truth. And so I think those are two forces that I've at least seen in my career.
The subjectivity of truth is a really fascinating topic.
Yes.
We could get into that too, but maybe not now.
We might not have time in 30 minutes. But I think that, so we kind of talked about that. Can you then talk a little bit, so I think one of the things that's really interesting is that I think we're in a world where we see increasing value in data and a bit of a paradox in terms of the actual friction around using that data effectively in our application development. So I'd love to maybe just talk a little bit about the value of data and the benefits that we could potentially unlock here if we can start to use it more effectively.
So one thing I'll throw in there is that I think in some ways part of the challenge and yet also part of the opportunity is that there's been this explosion in the number of databases, data stores, different tools that are out there for working with data, many of which arose from some of the challenges and constraints where, your traditional relational database, using it both for operational and analytical, becomes this huge bottleneck. This explosion of different tools, whether they're messaging tools or NoSQL stores or what have you, then almost becomes a bit of a distraction, I think, sometimes, where folks have sometimes looked at adopting these without necessarily staying true to kind of what are the problems that we're solving and who are our real customers in this situation. And so there was a great talk yesterday from Lenny over at Northern Trust, who promised to be here, and I told him he should probably be up on this panel. There he is. And he kind of walked through this evolution that Northern Trust has been on and highlighted how there are certain tools that were being adopted but ultimately kind of used for the wrong thing. And I think that lots of organizations have gone through that. And so that's been a challenge that's kind of inserted itself in there as well.
But I do think there is such a tremendous opportunity here,
Right.
because when we look at the explosion of data that is available, if you're a retailer, the amount of data that you can have on any specific customer is absolutely phenomenal. And then you look at the aggregate data and companies like Stitch Fix that are using that aggregate data to do predictive modeling and enable a clothing as a service company where you don't shop for clothes, they send you clothes, and their predictive model on what you're going to like is actually really good because of the amount of AI they're doing. It's phenomenal. So I get that there's a Cambrian explosion of data products.
Yeah.
And I think that it's kind of like this cycle that's feeding itself, because there's also a Cambrian explosion of the amount of data that's available and how that can not only power the business, but power change for the business.
Yeah,
and changing business models.
It's like, how do you take advantage of all this, innovation without kind of losing sight of what are the problems you're trying to solve?
Right, particularly since all the data gets fragmented and you don't have, it's hard to do machine learning on, many databases, all with different representations, all that kind of thing. So it's hard to pull all that together. And there's you can get databases faster. I know at the bank it used to take a long time to get a database. You would have to open a ticket and get a server, and other teams would install things. There's now cloud database, you can get that really fast, but the risk is now teams can much more quickly open up a new silo and take a copy.
Yeah.
So that runs, and that's the risk side of it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'm going to ignore my question. I want to dive more on silos. So, siloed data. I think one of the things that I think is interesting is that every organization, at least that I've encountered, is fighting against silos in terms of siloed data. I also think that a lot of times silos happen because we're trying to create better developer experience and faster, easier access for the people who want that specific data. Is there a way to avoid that? Like, can we marry these concepts of integrated data and also easy to access data?
Yeah, I think the issue is you need to govern the data and understand where it's coming from and have a common representation. Because I know a common pattern is it's in many databases. You start a data lake and you start ingesting it all, and then that's in many formats and you can't discover what you want, and then you just have the same problem, just different format. So what the approach we've been taking is we're moving a lot to cloud. We just got approval to move our PII data to cloud. So we're using this opportunity and we want to do analytics. So we need to bring that into a common format. So we're using this as an opportunity to start bringing in databases. We've got we have banking in 55 countries. In Canadian Bank, we've got like 2,000 production databases, all with different representations of everything. And it's really hard to do. You're never going to step in and refactor all the databases. So we're defining an enterprise data model and a business glossary so we can have a standard definition. We can say this is a customer's first name. And whenever we ingest data, you have to say, this is the customer's first name. You get the one representation of it, put it in a common schema so you can discover it. And then we're ingesting from there, and then that opens the door to more easily consume data, not get many copies of it, do analytics on the union of all the data. That's the approach we've been taking.
And I see a parallel with kind of some of those types of behaviors that are emerging at companies, and sometimes of what we see on the app and platform and ops side, right? Where, some of the teams that have been really successful in adopting Cloud Foundry have had a really strong product identity around the platform that they're building. And this is part of what's shifting that orientation between those developers and those platform operators. And they go so far as to call this as platform as product. But when I look at what some folks are sort of doing that are really innovative, like Scotiabank and Northern Trust and some other folks, HCSC comes to mind, where they're actually, and they may not be calling it this, but they're taking that product orientation around their data, the data itself, and bringing that product orientation towards how they interface with those developers, right? Setting up kind of clear, defined, this is, thou shalt use this schema, but it's also like, here's the API that you can use to get phone number data or email data from our members or customers or what have you. And so whether that's, and there's great parallels to what you take location data from Google and all the Google Maps APIs that are used so ubiquitously. And it's just a clean API interface for developers to use. There's a black box on the other side of whatever Google's doing with the amount of location data that they have. And what if you take that same orientation internally? And so that, I think of it as the product mindset is part of how you break down these silos. And so I'm kind of always hunting around for examples that sort of, in the tradition of confirmation bias, tell me that I'm on the right path.
Another piece that I think is important, like you can govern the schema and so forth, but the problem is you ingest this data and then it gets transformed many times and passed around, and you really need to govern the ETL code that's doing that.
Yeah, this kind of this chain of responsibility where somewhere along the line there's a reporting side of the house and there's business analytics who they've been taking the data that's coming in from various applications and after it's been transformed, et cetera. And when you make that breaking change in an application, that's the downstream customer that you didn't even know you had. And so how do those developers and those downstream internal customers of data, how do they then kind of have a different orientation so that they recognize this kind of customer relationship that they have internally?
Yeah, and I'd like to see the tools, when you're checking in ETL code, you want to know what is the implication of that. And if it's going to be transforming code that's going into the official source of data and you're transforming that, you want to know when you make the change, how far is this going to propagate? How much of the field, the whole data ocean are you actually going to modify? And what are the implications of that? And you want to know, and then set up invariants in those sources, and then you want to know, before you commit the change, are you breaking things 4 hops down when you start applying transformations? Right,
or can you provide those insulation layers, right, in those ETL pipelines so that, folks can make the changes that they need to, do different types of transformations that they need to without introducing a breaking change.
Well, and this is where all of the engineering practices, continuous integration, continuous delivery, test-driven development, start to apply to, because ETL, it's code. And And so you may not be able to prevent, one of the big bottlenecks to agility is when you've got a change control board that owns the schema, and you have to go before the board before you can change anything, as opposed to being able to detect very quickly when something has broken as a result of a schema change. So if everything is part of your pipeline, then you're able to respond much more quickly than if you have to go in front of the board and get blessed with the change that you want to make.
Right, and I think the infrastructure can probably help if it knows, what was the transformation used here, and now I've changed the schema, and this is now the new mapping, what was the origin of this data? Do you want to enforce this new schema on, you don't want to retransform the previous data? Is this a point in time thing? That whole piece.
So I think culturally that has some implications because historically the DBA and the change board are the people who are sitting there at the heart of the control plane on what data can and can't look like, what the schema can and can't look like. How does that look as we start to shift that to other organizations and to the developers? What's looking at me?
I'm an infrastructure guy. I just build the tools. I don't govern it.
I don't know if like the answer or the models have fully emerged there, right? This is where I can see some interesting things that people are doing, which suggests that it should be a different, orientation and relationship between these two groups. That's less of a, hey, I'm a blocker. I mean, it's not too unlike the panel we heard this morning with Justin on security, where it's like, how do we focus on enablement over approvals? And so a question of, how do DBAs start to take on an enabling role with developers and ETL integration specialists so that they're not blocking, they're enabling them to kind of safely make these changes. And some of it can maybe get kind of baked into pipelines, hopefully as much as possible, but I think it's not very different from what we see on the security side.
I think they're from a culture change standpoint, I think that when you've got a very siloed model, you end up with a for culture. Like, I get a ticket, I'm going to do that thing for you to resolve the ticket.
Yeah.
Whereas we call it radical collaboration at Pivotal, and when we have one of those kinds of, otherwise it would be one of those siloed and over the wall or do it for you kind of relationships, which frankly never works, by the way, because the person who does it for you on your behalf doesn't fully understand the context and is likely to get maybe 60% of what you actually needed right, and so then it's back and forth in multiple tickets, and so instead we bear hug. Like, okay, I would normally be doing this for you, but I'm now gonna come do this with you, and we're going to be very close in doing this together. It is a cultural transformation, though, and that I'm going to do it with you isn't always comfortable to people.
It's fascinating stuff. So if you were talking through culture change versus tooling change, in your experience, in particular as someone who's working to actively transform that, like, is this a chicken and egg problem? Have you had any success in doing one thing before the other?
So we're building out the infrastructure and new process, and then we're sort of starting fresh. We're just sort of, there was the old world that is the old world. We're building a new world with this infrastructure and governance rules and process and all that. And then we're just saying, when you ingest any new data in there, when you ingest, you need to follow these rules. There's all these checks. You map it to the standard schema, glossary, all that. And then you're entering the new world where these are enforced, because there's no way to come back to the teams with all their chaos and just say, hey, now start doing it this way. Doesn't work, I don't think.
Right. Well, I have plenty more questions, but does anyone in the audience actually want to query these bright minds while they're up here?
The panel, is it okay? There we go. Thank you, guys. So I've
messed with Kafka a bit, and there's this concept around no ETL, and I was wondering, how do you think that's going to fit into this relationship where you have to worry about data transformations, and then you can potentially transform data as it's moving through a pipeline. So there's also this concept in Kafka, streams, for example, or just having like a big data pipeline where you're ingesting all this stuff and people just start pulling from it. So you do have this this core of data that's not being manipulated, and then you manipulate sub-fractions of it. How do you guys feel like it's going to affect the relationship of data going forward into the cloud?
Well, on a blank slate, that sounds great.
I think it's going to be fascinating. I'm actually curious in terms of the architecture that you're implementing. Is this part of it, or are you doing something completely different?
So we are, when we ingest, so part of ingestion is tokenizing the PII and making sure that's all safe. So that's all done, kind of in flight before it lands. I think you do need to, whatever tools or infrastructure you're using, I think you need to understand the transformations, and you need to understand because you want to, if you discover you did it wrong, you need to be able to redo that. Or if you discover you did it wrong and it's actually mapped to the wrong field, it should be over here, you want to be able to automatically transform the data underneath, and you kind of need to understand what's going on. So I think you do need to understand what the transformation was. I guess you can, if you've got a tool that's not doing it, I guess you still need to understand in the glossary, you need to understand that, in the source, in the original source, that you are transforming from these fields, and this field is mapped to here in the standard schema. So you need the mapping of that at least, and then you need to, because that might change, and then you need to be able to, do the right thing.
I think you still have kind of a notion of downstream customers that if you remove a field, right? The marketing team says, hey, we've got to stop asking all these questions because folks aren't completing the form. So we're going to actually cut down on the number of fields, the amount of data that we're capturing for something we're doing. I'm just making that. But as a marketing, I actually know that those conversations happen. So that then means like, well, what if someone downstream was actually depending on, I needed to know the state, or I needed to know the zip code or something. And now you're not capturing that up here. I'm not sure putting Kafka in your to replace your integration pipeline solves that problem. So you still have to kind of solve for how do you relay these kind of downstream customers, or how do you kind of put the controls in place for developers to not introduce those types of breaking changes.
And I think that the event stream as the raw data that you store is a really fascinating idea. I think that there are some challenges that it's important to think about, like GDPR, for example, the right to be forgotten. If you haven't thought ahead about that, then you're going to have a really hard time complying with that. So it's not that you can't, it's that you just have to think ahead about it.
And I think I'd separate understanding the transformations. So yes, you can track where the data flowed and how to fix that, which is separate from streaming and event-driven versus calling through APIs and stuff. It's sort of two different pieces.
Hi, thank you for I had a question about, we have legacy data modeling that we want to kind of like a table that just needs to be split up, into smaller tables. Like what is and we have an option of either doing that transformation, that adaptation on a service level or like a database trigger way. Is there like a preferred pattern of doing that kind of, necessary schema updates, schema changes, and not, and kind of being compatible, with your other ingestion pipelines?
Rachel, I'm curious what your answer is to this.
I would, usually when you're dealing with databases, like the choking the database model is usually a pretty safe bet of trying to build out the database with the smaller components that you need and then start funneling traffic to that, make sure everything works, start doing tests, and then keep your action. So you have to keep things paired for a while. You have to make sure that you have data in two places, but that is a way in which you can start to build out and split your database up into smaller, like microservice databases, orientations, things like that, and do it a little bit more safely with a little bit more control. So if anything goes wrong, you can roll back to your master database. But that's one person.
Well, it kind of related to that, and I actually don't know how bad a word Ruby on Rails is in this community. I mean, it just kind of ducked this way. But I found the Ruby on Rails database upgrade downgrade pattern incredibly valuable, because it's got this notion of, first of all, you don't ever make a breaking change. Like if you're going to delete a column, you soft delete initially at least, because you need to be able to roll back. And if you've deleted it, the data is gone. So But Ruby on Rails has some really nice patterns for how you think about doing this in a safe way. Now that is at an application level, as opposed to at like the central database level. But if you are inspired by that vision, I'm pretty sure that you could adapt the pattern to a much larger context.
All right, anyone else out there? All right, well, any other last pearls of wisdom before we break? Why is everyone looking?
No. See, we didn't get much of a chance to sync ahead of time. And so when I look at you two, it's more to see if I jump in, am I stepping on you?
No, go for it.
Pearls of wisdom. If agility is the ability to deliver a continuous stream of value at a sustainable pace while adapting to the changing needs of the business, and if anything that interferes with going from concept to delivery is friction within the system, when you look specifically at data, there are so many points of friction, but I think that there's also so many evolving new patterns, and some of them are going to be wildly different, and you are going to have to choose. Am I going to go with an event stream? Am I going to go with wrapping my data in an API? But thinking about eliminating the sources of friction, all of the places where you have to have a ticket in order to get something done, where your developers can't do self-service, or where you have such a huge gap between the people who are defining the data and the people who actually have to do reporting after the fact. Like that is such a long latency if you haven't brought the reporting people in up front. That would be my like one thing of wisdom. I don't know if that's wisdom, but my one thing is go find all of the things that represent friction in your ability to get to delivery of value, and just systematically remove every one of those points of friction.
I'm all for going fast, and that makes sense. The challenge is making sure you're not just going faster to the chaotic state of not actually knowing what you've got. So I think it's easy to not pay attention to, is the data right? What's the relationship of it? There's one representation, all that, which you need before you can do all the analytics and machine learning that is now available. So we're paying a lot of attention to the governance and just understanding what the relationship of all the pieces of data is.
I think the minds that are really good at governance are in relatively short supply, and so how do you figure out how do you expose that to more developers and consumers and producers of data in a way that's scalable? So I'm going to just kind of come back to my currently hypothesis, not, I would say, fully baked thesis yet, of the product orientation. But then also, I guess, adding in kind of that enablement over approval as probably a corollary to that.
And you know, when you're committing all the code, you put in, you know, pre-commit tests to make sure this is consistent. You need that around the data, and it needs to be not just this piece of data, but in the landscape that you're not screwing it up.
It's one of those planets in John Schneider's CI/CD and all the other solar system objects from this morning.
Yeah. So you can enforce it. So we enforce that, but we're not enforcing it on the data, and I think we need to.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.